Karl Marx, born in 1818 and died in 1883, is perhaps one of the most cited theoretical and discussed in our modern history. His most famous academic works are monumental efforts of historical, social, and economic analysis. So comprehensive, ideas brought contributions both to the area of sociology, as economics, philosophy, history, political science, and among many others. Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, and Max Weber were considered the three classical thinkers because their jobs have become pillars for the construction of sociological studies. Just as Durkheim, Marx's interest was to understand the social changes witnessed during the Industrial Revolution. He saw firsthand the rapid process of growth of plants in industrial production and the consequent growth of social inequality. His close relationship with European labor movements of the time influenced his writings and his theoretical approach, although it devoted more to issues of area economy. Its comprehensive vision also considered the events that were connected to the social world. Precisely for this reason, his works are widely used in sociological studies. Although it has been dedicated to the study of different historical movements, was the transition from modernity that most interested him. Social phenomena observed were profound and complex, so that changed the whole social structure of the European world and later around the rest of the world. However, Marx focused on the changes involving the development of capitalism in the new context that was presented. His interest was due to the large differences that the capitalist system was concerning production systems that previously appeared in human history, because the focus of this system was the large-scale production of consumer goods. Who was Karl Marx? Economist, philosopher, and German socialist, Karl Marx was born in Trier on May 5, 1818, and died in London on 14 March 1883. He studied at the University of Berlin, especially the Hegelian philosophy, and graduated in Jena in 1841, with the thesis about the differences of a philosophy of nature of Democritus and Epicurus. In 1842, he took over the writing of the newspaper Rhenish in Cologne, where its radical democratic articles angered the authorities. In 1843, he moved to Paris, editing in 1844 the first volume of the German-French Annals, main body of the Hegelian left. However, soon broke with the leaders of this movement, Bruno Bauer and Rouget. In 1844, he met in Paris Friedrich Engels, the beginning of a close friendship throughout life. It was the following year, expelled from France, was rooting in Brussels and participating in clandestine organizations of workers and exiles. At the same time in France, the revolution broke out in February 24, 1848. Marx and Engels published the pamphlet The Communist Manifesto, the first draft of revolutionary theory that would later be called Marxist. He returned to Paris but soon became the head of the new Rhenish newspaper and colony first daily newspaper, frankly socialist. After the defeat of all revolutionary movements in Europe and the newspaper's closure, whose editors were reported and prosecuted, Marx went to Paris and then set off to London, where he resided. In London, dedicated to vast economic and historical studies, and a frequent visitor to the British Museum reading room, he wrote articles for American newspapers on foreign policy. But the material situation has always been very precarious. It was generously helped by Engels, who lived in Manchester on sound financial condition. In 1864, Marx was the co-founder of the International Federation of Trade Unions, later called the First International, playing the dominant role of director. In 1867, he published the first volume of his major work, Capital. Within the International, Marx found the tenacious opposition of the anarchists led by Bakunin, and in 1872, at the Hague Congress, the association was almost dissolved. In contrast, Marx could sponsor the founding in 1875, the German Social Democratic Party, which was, however, soon after prohibited. Not lived enough to attend the electoral victories of his party and other socialist groups in Europe. In childhood, Karl Heinrich Marx was born in Trier, south of Prussia, May 5, 1818. He was the second of 8 children of lawyer Herschel Marx and his wife, the Dutch Henriette Presburg. His paternal grandfather was a Jewish rabbi. However, Herschel, for fear of the consequence of anti-Jewish laws enacted by the King of Prussia, converted to Protestantism in 1824 when Karl was a child. Marx's mother also converted from Jewish rabbis, but throughout his life was interested in exercising doctrinal influence on the child. Karl's parents were a harmonious couple, which seems to have contributed substantially to the formation of his personality. As indicated by various assessments of his teachers, Marx was an excellent student. He completed high school successfully, passing the exam of maturity. His final dissertation can draw 2 significant phrases that have really demonstrated their exceptional intellect. Neither can always embrace the profession for which we believe to be prepared. Our position in the company is in certain defined measure before we have conditions determined it. And, quote, the nature of man is such a way that it cannot achieve their perfection, but act for the right and the perfection of humanity. Unquote. The purpose of the period from 1843 to early 1845 he spent in Paris was a real turning point in the course of Marx's life and his activities. There he toured the historical sites of the French Revolution. His impression was so vigorous and intense that he read French historians, found thus the class struggle which the bourgeois held against the nobility. See that the philosophy of the Enlightenment not occasioned by itself the revolution, and that before accompanied and stimulated the movement goal of the struggle between the classes. It concluded that the high bourgeois that was in power had nothing revolutionary, being unable to meet the democratic tasks, and now the momentum of liberation would come from a new class, the workers and employees, the proletarian class. The ability to rid society of the various forms of oppression was now in the hands of this class, since it became aware of its class interests and acts in an organized manner. Marx puts to a profound criticism of capitalism, which considers the greatest cause of alienation of humanity. It describes the economy as being of central importance to other aspects of human existence. It is appropriate to engage fully in activities that sought to improve the living conditions of workers. He criticized, so primarily, theoretical communists, and defended the action, real communism. Paul Lafargue, his son-in-law and secretary, reports that Marx rested walking from one side to another of the room, coming to form a trail in the floor. The work was so much that Karl often forgot to eat. It was extremely meticulous, rigorous, and capricious with their jobs. It was with Capital, published in 1867, and has become the central reference in the social sciences and, as the Communist Manifesto, established the principles of a doctrine based on historical analysis of human societies. To coordinate the action of the proletariat against the capitalist exploitation, in 1864, he created the International Workers' Association in London. Marx was at his soul, being the author of the first Call and a large number of resolutions, declarations, and manifestos. By uniting the labor movement of various countries, trying to steer an ordinary activity via different forms of non-proletarian socialism, pre-Marxists of Manzini, Proudhon, Bakunin, the trade unionism English liberal, the oscillations of Lassallean's right in Germany, etc. Combating the theories of all these sects and schools, Marx was forging a unique tactic for the proletarian struggle of the working class in different countries. After the fall of the Paris Commune in 1871, which Marx analyzed in The Civil War in France, 1871, in such a pervasive way, so fair, so bright, so useful, and revolutionary. And after the split caused by Bakunists, the International could not continue to exist in Europe. After the 1872 Hague Congress, Marx managed the transfer of the International General Council to New York. The First International had fulfilled its historic mission and gave way to a growing, seasoned, infinitely greater labor movement in all countries of the world, characterized by its extension and development, the formation of Socialist Party workers' masses under the various national states. His intense activity in international and its theoretical work, which required even greater efforts, definitely shaken Marx's health. He continued his work of transformation of the political economy and finishing of the capital, gathering a mass of new documents and studying various languages, including Russian, for example, but illness prevented him from finishing the capital. With unanimous approval of the General Committee, Marx obtains consent to the publication of the text drafted, containing the statutes stating the purpose of the association, and becomes the central leader of the same. Dialectical materialism, the Hegelian dialectic, was the dialectic of idealism and materialism as a dialectical philosophical position that considers the matter as the only reality and that denies the existence of the soul, the afterlife, and God. The reality is contradictory, but the contradiction excels in the synthesis that is the truth of overcome movements. Marx historically considered as an opposition of classes linked to certain types of social organization. Marx had a revolutionary philosophy that sought to demonstrate the internal contradictions of class society and overcoming requirements. Ludwig Feuerbach sought to introduce materialist dialectics, fighting the Hegelian doctrine, which, along with its revolutionary method, concluded by an eminently conservative doctrine. Marx rejects, as Feuerbach, idealism, but, on the contrary, does not seek to preserve the values of Christianity. Marx's dialectics postulates that the laws of thought correspond to the laws of reality. Dialectics is not only thought, is thought, and reality at the same time. But matter and its historical content dictate the Marxist dialectic. The reality is contradictory to dialectical thinking. The dialectical contradiction is not only an external contradiction, but the unity of contradictions. Marx accuses Feuerbach, stating that his humanism and his dialectics were static. Feuerbach, as a man, has no dimensions, are outside of society and history, is a pure abstraction. It is essential, according to Marx's understanding, the historical reality and its contradictions, to try to overcome them dialectically. Dialectic proclaims the following principles. Everything is related. Law of reciprocal action and universal connection. Everything changes. Law of universal transformation and unceasing development. The qualitative changes are consequences of quantitative revolutions. The contradiction is internal, but the contrary unit at a later time. The struggle of opposites is the engine of thought and reality. The materiality of the world. The precedent of matter in relation to consciousness. The spiritual life of society as a result of material life. Historical materialism, in Marx's theory, historical materialism seeks the explanation of the history of human society at all times through the materials, mainly economic and technical facts. The society base. The society is compared to a building on which the foundations, infrastructure, would be represented by economic forces, while the building itself, the superstructure, represents the ideas, customs, institutions, such as political, religious, legal, etc. What Marx is most critical of is the question of how to understand what is man, not having consciousness or rationale, nor be a political animal, which gives the man his singularity, but being able to produce their conditions existence, both material and ideal, which distinguishes man. The essence of man is not having an essence. The essence of man is something that he builds, that is, history. Class struggle intending characterizes not only an economic view of history, but also a historical view of the economy. And the Marxist theory also seeks to explain the revolution of economic relations in human societies throughout the historical process. There would be, according to Marx's theory, a permanent dialectic of power between powerful and weak, oppressor and oppressed. The history of mankind would be a permanent class struggle, as is made clear in the first sentence of the first chapter of the Communist Manifesto. The history of all past society is the history of class struggle. Those classes, to Engels, are the products of economic relations of his time. So despite the apparent differences, slavery, servitude, and capitalism are not necessarily successive stages of a single process. The basis of society's economic output. On this economic basis rises a superstructure of state and economic ideas, social, political, moral, philosophical, and artistic. Marx wanted the inversion of the social pyramid, that is, putting in power most the workers, who would be the only force capable of destroying the capitalist society and build a new society, a socialist society. For Marx, the workers would be dominated by the ideology of the ruling class, i.e., the ideas that they have to the world, and society would be the same ideas that the bourgeois spreads. Capitalism would be hit by economic crisis because it has become the obstacle to the development of productive forces. It would be absurd that the entire humanity is dedicated to working in the mood to provide subordinate to a handful of big business. The economy of the future associate, all men and peoples of the world, could only be controlled production of all men and peoples. For Marx, the more the world is economically unified, it needs socialism. There is not just an economic crisis, there is a revolution. What is decisive is the actions of social classes that, for Marx and Engels, in all societies in which the property is private, there are class struggles by lords, slaves, feudal serfs by nobles, bourgeois by proletariats. The capitalist proletarian struggle should not be limited to the fight of trade unions for better wages and living conditions. It should also be the ideological struggle for socialism, was known by workers as a political struggle for the seizure of power. In this field, the proletariat should rely on a key weapon, the political party, the revolutionary political party that has a democratic structure, and to seek to educate workers and to get them to organize themselves to take power through a socialist revolution. Marx tried to demonstrate that in capitalism there would always be social injustice, and that the only way a person was to become wealthy and increase his fortune would be by exploiting the workers, i.e., capitalism, according to Marx's wild theory, because the worker produces more for their boss than the cost to society. And capitalism is necessarily presented as an economic system of exploitation. Surplus value is the fundamental law of this system. The power sold by the operator to the boss will not be used for 6 hours, but during 8, 10, 12, or more hours. The capital gain is the difference between the price at which the trader buys the labor force at 6 hours and the price at which he sells the result, 10 hours, for example. Thus, the lower price paid to the worker and the longer the duration of the working day, the greater the business profit. The Communist Manifesto made humanity walk the solution of problems such as poverty and the exploitation of labor. The Communist Manifesto is an affirmative set of ideas, of truths, that the revolutionaries of the time believed to contain, according to them, scientific evidence, somewhat economistic, for understanding social change. Assign the communists more decision, advance, lucidity, and leadership than the other fractions that seek to represent the proletariat. Its objectives are regarded as common: the organization of the proletariat to the conquest of political power, and the bourgeois supremacy destruction. You can cut the irony with a sharp knife into 3 types of socialism of the time. The revolutionary socialism, divided into feudal socialism, petty bourgeois, and German socialism, the conservative and bourgeois socialism, and the socialism and critical utopian socialism. The Communist Manifesto, and triumphalist and encouraging, does not spiritualize, but thrill to the fight. Interestingly, it takes the idea of the ghost into wanting the ruling class to tremble at the idea of a revolutionary communist. The workers, who would win the world in the revolution, are also, after all, called upon in the famous words, "So many dreams, life projects, and social revolutions have all inspired. Of all countries, proletarians unite." Engels and the family. It is impossible to speak of Marx without remembering Engels. His political activities, intellect, and activists are closely linked. Engels was the son of a very religious and conservative industrialist and raised in an environment dominated by pietism, the most rigorous trend of German Protestantism. At 19, he began publishing articles with popular content in the city magazines. At 24, Engels read the Rheinische Zeitung. It was received coldly by Marx, having not taken the seriousness of the Liberated, an extremist group which Engels was a part and promoted noisy activities. Still, Marx published 2 of his articles. The 2 men met again in Paris in 1844. Engels was finishing a study of the English capitalist system and was very interested in the work of Marx. There began a lasting friendship. Engels was a dedicated consultant of Marx's work, struggling a lot with his friend and at various times financially supporting Marx's family. In 1848, together they would shake and transform the world, writing the great Communist Manifesto. After the death of Marx, Engels began to complete and disseminate the work of his friend into the world. In 1895, Engels died of esophageal cancer. The friendship between them is evident in such statement as, quote, "Dear Fred, have just to correct the last leaf capital notebook. The preface, remedy, corrected yesterday. This part is completed. Then only thanks. Without you, it would not be possible for me to carry out this huge work of 3 volumes without your sacrifice. Hugs and many thanks, Karl." Unquote. Also, 7 years after Marx's death, Engels wrote, "My destiny is that spoon, glory, and seeds of honor which are planted in greater somebody than I. So to Karl Marx, I can only promise to dedicate the rest of my life to his service and be an asset for the proletariat, if possible, to one day become worthy of their honor." It is reported that Marx was a gentle and loving father. He would love to walk with his family and said that children should educate parents. He and his family suffered several misfortunes, but his family always supported him. He said that the man-woman relationship was an exchange of values. But when one partner is allowed to sell the money, the values are opposite. Love turns to hate, fidelity is diluted. Love is the means of man to be held as a person, he said. Marx never had any personal enemies, but he had a habit of discussing his ideas with other philosophers, which brought about many controversies. One of these philosophers was Proudhon, a man famous in the French labor movement. Marx wrote to him inviting him to join the Communist Correspondence Committees, which promoted the exchange of communists from various countries. Proudhon responded by refusing to adhere to the movement, to challenge the internationalism of Marx and his economic ideas. The idea of Proudhon cooperatives was far from the efforts of Marx and Engels to organize the struggle of the proletarian classes against the bourgeois. These values of the French philosopher were reported in his book Philosophy of Poverty, written by Marx. In this book, he advocated anarchist ideals, a society based on owning small amounts of property. Marx's answer came with Misery, book of philosophy, which states that Hegel, Proudhon had only acquired vocabulary, and critiqued the Reformism and called their ideas petty bourgeois and uncompromising with the working class. Also polemical with Bakunin, who was the father of anarchism. He was a revolutionary Hegelian training and advocating the general strike, challenged by Marx, saying that it was a myth that could affect the organization of the working class, which must mature patiently. Bakunin admired the knowledge of Marx, but considered boastful and advocated worker self-organization. Marx said about Bakunin's program, "It is a salad of platitudes, of meaningless chatter, a wreath of concepts, and insipid improvisation." Death and legacy during the last 10 years of Marx's life were marked by the deterioration of his health. He suffered liver disorders for over 20 years and was the victim of violent and persistent headaches that led to insomnia. Contradicting medical orders, he continued working until late at night, eating less than even before. Already in 1881, he was a patient condemned by the medical community. He could not devote a lot of the writing of books 2 and 3 of the Capital. Some passages have gigantic notes to Engels and to find a home with revolutionary communist militants from around the world. Several of Marx's children died very young in London when the family was going through great misery. 3 of his daughters married English and French socialists: Eleanor Aveling, Laura Lafargue, and Jenny Longuet. One of the sons of the latter is French Socialist Party member. The final blow comes with Jenny's death on December 2, 1881, and with his dearest daughter, who bore the mother's name in 1883. 2 months after this event, on March 14, Karl Marx passed away at his desk in his office, living in a consumptive hovel. He was buried in Highgate Cemetery along with his wife in London, in the reserved sector of people banned and rejected by the Anglican Church. On the edge of the grave, Engels gave an emotional funeral oration. Marx was before all a revolutionary. His real mission in life was to contribute, one way or another, to society, tips on capitalism and state institution in these raised, to contribute to the liberation of modern proletarianism, which he was the first to become aware of their position and their needs, aware of the conditions of their emancipation. The fight was his element, and he fought with a toughness and a success with whom few might rival. Marx was hated by more men, and over time slandered. Governments, either absolute now Republicans, deported the territory of its bourgeois, whether they were conservative or ultra-democraticos, strove between the launched defamations against him. All this he put aside, as if they were spiderwebs, not aware, only responding when there was an extreme need compelled him. Tall and died loving, revered and mourned by millions of the fellow workers of the Revolutionary, of the Siberian mines of California, all parties of Europe and America. And I dare say that even though he might have had many opponents, he did not have any personal enemies. The materialist conception of history. By giving real life the consequential nature, incomplete and one-sided, of the old materialism, Marx was led to the conviction that it was necessary to put science according to the materialistic-based society and rebuild the supporting science on that basis. If in general materialism explains consciousness by being and not the contrary, it requires, when applied to the social life of humanity, which explains social consciousness by social being. The technology, says Marx, Capital 1, shows the active attitude of man to nature, the immediate process of production of his life, and therefore their social living conditions and spiritual representations derived from that place. In 35a, the complete formation of the fundamental principles of materialism as applied to human society and its history is given by Marx in the preface of his book, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, in these terms. In the social production of their existence, men enter into certain relations that are necessary, independent of their will, relations of production which correspond to a definite degree of development of the material productive forces. The set of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which rises a legal and political superstructure, to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the process of social and political and intellectual in general. It is not the consciousness of man that determines their being, but, on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. At a certain stage of their development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or, what is but a legal expression, that, with the property relations within which they had moved so far. From forms of development of productive forces, these relations become their fetters. Abbreviated, this would lead to an era of social revolution. The change in the economic base revolutionized, more or less quickly, the whole enormous superstructure. In considering such revolutions, one must always distinguish between the material transformations and the economic conditions of production, which can be checked with the rigor typical of the natural sciences, and the legal, political, religious, aesthetic, or philosophical forms, in short, forms ideological under which men become conscious of this conflict and fight for resolve. Just as you cannot judge an individual by the idea that he makes himself also cannot judge such a period of revolutions by the awareness that it has of itself. Rather, it is necessary to explain this consciousness from the contradictions of material life, the conflict between the social productive forces and relations of production. In broad strokes, the modes of Asian production, ancient feudal and modern bourgeois, can be designated as so many times of progress in the economic formation of society. To this end, see a brief formula that Marx gives in his letter to Engels dated of July 7, 1866. Our theory of work organization determined by the means of production. The discovery of the material conception of history, or more precisely, the application, the consequent extension of materialism to social phenomena domain eliminated the two main defects of the theories of Marx's previous history. First, they consider at best ideological mobiles of the historical activity of man, without investigating the origin of these mobiles, without grasping the objective laws governing the development of the system of social relations, and without discovering the roots of these relations in a degree of development of material production. Second, previous theories not encompassed precisely the action of the population of the masses, while historical materialism allows for the first time to study with the accuracy of the natural sciences the social conditions of life of the masses and the changes of these conditions. The sociology and historiography before Marx, at best, accumulated raw facts, collected piecemeal, and exposed some aspect of the historical process. Marxism pioneered the universal and complete study of the birth process, developing and decline of economic social formations, examining all the contradictory tendencies connecting the conditions of existence and production, precisely determinable, the various classes of society away from the subjectivism and arbitrariness in the selection of the different ideas dominant or in their interpretation, revealing the roots of all the ideas and all the various tendencies, without exception, in the state of material productive forces. Men are the architects of their history, but the causes to determine the mobiles of men, and more precisely of the masses. What is the cause of conflicts of ideas and contradictory aspirations? Is it representing all these conflicts in the mass of human societies? What are the objective conditions of production of material life in which it is based in all historical activity of men? What is the law that governs the development of these conditions? Marx has focused his attention on all these issues and paved the way for the scientific study of history conceived as a single process governed by laws, despite its prodigious variety of aspects and all its contradictions. Legacy. Marx died, but his legacy is immortal. Today, he has inspired great revolutions that have made the proletariat a more formal class. It is still subdued by capitalism. It lives in the shadows. But we cannot deny the progress made during years of struggle against an exploitative bourgeois. Cooperatives and later unions were created to defend the rights of workers. Demonstrations and riots claimed respect for this class, and it all started with Marx. It is still a scarce culture, and the dignity and the lives of workers, but it is more than they had 200 years ago. They take as their example fighters such as people like Karl Marx, one of the most celebrated thinkers ever produced by humanity. This example is that we can build a fairer society. Marx did not intend to make a finished analysis and a definitive definition of capitalism, because he knew he could not stifle history. He was aware of the capitalist dynamic, but could not come forward to their historical moment forecasting and analyzing imperialism and globalism, for example. And he could not fathom the predominance of services, entertainment, communications, and financial flows at the expense of industrial production. He could not imagine the new theoretical category should be developed to account for the reality that would change gradually, such as fictitious capital, virtual company, outsourcing, state capitalism, immaterial labor, symbolic work. His analysis was, therefore, synchronic, while their analysis methods have diachronic application. So, it is ironic that in this age of instant and ephemeral fads, point in some localized spots one that is anachronistic and without any connection with reality. I am referring to a free anti-Marxist rant in some tiny circles which intend to inflate up and stand to disseminate inconsistent rhetoric of evil, tact catchphrases, misunderstanding, exhibitionism, and authoritarian intolerance, claiming that capital is outdated, belongs to the history of ideas. Marx would support globalization. Marx is illusion. Capitalism is a fetish. Marxism is insufficient to understand the globalization of our time. With the failure of the USSR proved the failure of Marxism. Capitalism is eternal, and others similar devoid of theoretical or even argumentative ballast. Fillers are empty rhetoric because it dismisses arguments and pleas, practical, however, which are rare good sense and sound intellectual formation. There are even those who do a caricature of the object that criticizes to combat it efficiently, which reveals mental destitution and prevents debate. This fad shows that the work of Marx is important and current. It is necessary and urgent to promote intellectual emancipation, the expansion of consciousness, and perhaps curb arrogant exhibitionism, and is asinine. The anti-Marx buzzword, however, is explained in a time dominated by the liberal thought and pragmatism in its most narrow-minded and intolerant forms, where the concentration of wealth is a goddess celebrated in the market, this hybrid being omniscient, ubiquitous, omnipotent, and sacred temples boasting on your porch. Extra consumo nulla, salvatio est.